I think you already can tell we are already literally in the middle of our plenary session on philanthropy and climate change. Please allow me to invite Briggs to come back, Briggs Bomba from TrustAfrica, who will be moderating the plenary session. And with him will be Alan Wallis from African Climate Foundation, Ruth Nyambura from African Eco-Feminist Collective, Sithembile Mwamakamba from FANRPAN, and they will be having this session. Briggs, please do come. I think you're already literally in your session already in terms of the plenary on climate change. I will give you a 30-minute session if I may, because I think we did take a number of questions. If I may be kind to you, just 30 minutes. If you just bring yourself, I've got your 2 mics for your guests. You will come use my podium. And then I'll just get 2 chairs for you here, just 2 chairs, yes. Your guests can sit, you will stand. You look like a fit young man, I can tell. The deception of the beard is very evident, but you look like you are in the best of your health, in the prime of your health, all right? And our 2 guests, please do come, and Briggs will take over. Just 30 minutes if I may.
Good morning once again. Wow, time is the greatest tyranny that you'll ever come across. We have a very eminent panel to help us explore some of the things that are coming from Maseho's keynote presentation, as well as bring into the conversation the various insights from the different sectors that everyone is working from. The name is Briggs Bomba, as already been said. I'm the programs director for TrustAfrica. We're a Pan-African foundation headquartered in Dakar, Senegal, working on contributing towards solving some of the continent's most pressing challenges. And I think, as we've heard from Morris at the very beginning, Ebrima and Maseko now, this question of climate change is an existential question for us as humanity. We are not even sure whether we will be able, as our precedent generations did, to pass on a livable world to the next generation. So as we get, as I invite our speakers, I'm going to ask them to just do a quick round of telling us the meaning of their names as they settle down. That's the introduction. All the other details about their PhDs and masters and all of these things are somewhere located on the website for the conference, so you can find them. Let me start with you, Sithembile. What does Sithembile mean?
Good morning, everyone. Sithembile means we are trusting in you, or we believe in you. I'm the firstborn in my family, so I have the heavy burden of being the one that shows the way to my siblings. So I am supposed to be exemplary. So I think when they gave me that name, they believed that I'll be that exemplary sibling. Yeah.
Please give her a big hand. We believe in her, we trust in her, we are looking up to your example. Nyambura. IT, help us. So Sithembile, as Nyambura is coming, Sithembile is the director of policy research and analysis at Food, Agriculture and Natural Resources Policy Analysis Network, FANRPAN, as we all know them. Over to you, Nyambura.
Nyambura means daughter of the rain. In Kikuyu mythology in Kenya, origin mythology, so they are the 9 original daughters of the founders, Gikuyu and Mombi. So we basically, the rainmaker, the one who blesses or curses the land, and the one who gives birth to children who also bless or curse the land.
So she wields the power to bless or to curse. Welcome. Give her a big hand, Nyambura. Nyambura is with the African Eco-Feminist collective. Let's move on to Alan. You must promise to keep it as interesting as the first two. Over to you.
Definitely no pressure. So Alan, if I'm correct, I need to think back to the story my mother told me when I was young, is he who is calm and who feels. And it's quite fitting because I think I see a former colleague in the audience there nodding at me, is that someone who cares big and feels big. And as a result, I've ended up in the human rights climate and fighting big fights, getting on the nerves of many governments.
He who cares and feels big. Big end for Alan. Well done, well done. Thank you. So we move straight into just some brief inputs from our panel. And I'm going to start with you, Alan. If you could just take 5-7 minutes maximum, just to give us your take on this climate change question, relating to some of what we heard earlier, but also the very important work that you are doing as part of the African Climate Foundation, as the head of strategy, African Climate Foundation. Over to you, Alan.
Great, thank you. And I'll talk a bit about the African Climate Foundation and the reason why it was set up, and it really is linked to a lot of the comments and the concerns and questions that Maseka raised in her opening address. And actually, I feel that we should have compared notes because a lot of her statistics and some of the reports she used were very similar. But I think what it really speaks about is how we view climate as a threat, and it is, absolutely. But this narrative change to one of opportunity really needs to be unlocked. That climate change is central to Africa's development trajectory. The siloing is very real, and I think it really points to the gaps that philanthropy can make a difference. So about building that bridge between the climate imperative and the economic and social development imperative. And that's really where it is. So I think if we can, as a philanthropy, begin using the convening power of the resources and networks to really align thinking to broader developmental thinking, not as a sidebar or a footnote. And even as philanthropy, we tend to talk about climate philanthropy, climate change. It's everything change. It's a systemic risk. And if we're talking about systems change, we need to put climate and the responses to climate in that traditional development thinking. So if there's one thing that I would like to draw on is saying is that African philanthropy has the potential to really collaborate, to look at the solutions. Because that's one thing, we all know what climate change is going to do. I don't think we should spend the next 30 minutes talking about droughts, or polar bears, or floods. I think we need to be talking about the opportunities that climate responses can have. And this really speaks to the question of the day, and it speaks to the rationale behind the African Climate Foundation's establishment. That we work at the nexus of climate change and development. We don't view climate change as purely an emissions or an environmental issue. Obviously, it's important, but we look at sectors, critical economic sectors for Africa, that either have the potential to contribute to development or extremely vulnerable to climate change. So in that space, and maybe I'll spend some time because I won't talk about agriculture, but the two program areas that are growing are the energy access and energy transitions, and sustainable land use in agriculture. And I know I have an expert on this panel, so I won't get into that space. But if we talk about a transition, purely building wind farms or solar farms, it simplifies what needs to be done. There's an infrastructure deficit that needs to be invested in Africa, beyond just the technology about bringing out wind farms and rolling out renewable energy. But on top of that, if you look at what is driving development pathways in Africa, it's investments in Africa's fossil fuel reserves. If Africa, we always tell Africa as the continent with the most renewable resources, yet 2% of investments in renewable energy came to Africa. That 88% or 98% was outside of Africa. So
I think it's also about locating this notion of a transition is about change. It's about looking at the different sectors and the systems and what's needed. And if we're going to displace one technology, we need to find the displacement equivalent. And by displacement equivalent is that if you're looking at the benefits that a path actually brings, if you're going to try and crowd in or renewable energy, for instance, over fossil fuels, it must yield the same benefits, at least developmental, environmental, and social. And usually that's the win. So to that space, and it speaks to, I think, the evidence base we need, right? We talk about climate scientists. We also need finance experts, investment bankers, because once we move into the space about actually attracting the investments into the solutions that could put Africa on a decarbonized pathway, and actually I think maybe let's use low carbon, because Africa is decarbonized. I think the use of net zero in Africa is that our base is very low, and in terms of where we are. But it's about really looking at breaking down the silos between the different types of efforts and activisms, and types of activism, from economic to social to environmental. And then I think the final layer is narrative change, and I'll stop there in terms of the enabling environment and ecosystem. We need the technical specialists, but we need media. We need to be supporting journalists to be able to report and cover a lot of these issues. So, and then we also need to be funding people. And the lack of African voice, and I agree with Maseko, it's not about that there isn't African excellence, and a key focus of ACFs is about finding those African voices and actually giving them the platform and the resources they need to work on these issues. And so there's so many entry points to look at, because this problem is big, it is complex, but the complexity is also an opportunity in itself. So I will leave it there, and maybe talk specifically about energy, perhaps in some Q&A in terms of some of the specific types of interventions we can get to there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan. A big hand for you. Let's move to Nyambura. Your 5-7 minutes take on the issue.
Okay. So it's actually good to speak after him, because he basically, Alan, takes me straight to my very first point. So, I mean, one of the things that I sit and when I'm here and I'm listening to everybody speaking, and even thinking about, philanthropy in Africa, it's almost like we have this idea that we come from, we basically have the same ideological positioning when it comes to what we think solutions around the climate crisis in Africa is, and we do not. For those who work with grassroots or within grassroots movements, social movements on this continent, a lot of the solutions being pushed by foundations, non-governmental organizations, African governments have no bearing, literally do not represent, reflect the dreams, aspirations of grassroots movements on the continent. And I think it's important to start with that, because I feel like there's been so much conversation about, we are starting from philanthropy. This is what needs to be invested in. This is what needs to be done. But there is a wider conversation about, the template of the continent. When we talk about the climate crisis, remember we are talking about a crisis that is historical in nature. This is a continent that is shaped, is shaped by a colonial encounter. The kinds of crises you see, whether it's in agriculture, whether we see the kinds of agricultural investments we've been seeing in the last 20 years, when we think about the economic models that we continue to have, these are particular legacies. And I think for me, beyond anything, I think it's important to get it together in terms of, when we talk about this is what Africa wants, or this is what African movements want, which movements exactly are we talking about? What the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa wants, what PACJA wants, what the African Eco-Feminist Collective wants, is not the same thing, for example, as the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa wants, which is being fought by the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa. So I think the ideological questions around what philanthropy means And can philanthropy exist in a context under which where we know that philanthropy in itself is contested in terms of how do you get all this money? Where does the money for philanthropy actually come from? If you want to go deeper into that conversation, that's something to actually think about. The second thing to think about is when you look at Africa, not just as a continent, but looking at it in terms of whether it's multilateral discussions at the United Nations, thinking about the last 2-3 years, the COP meetings, but also new initiatives such as nature-based solutions, even the term you just used, net zero, which is heavily contested by movements, a sort of another form of enclosure, capitalist enclosure. Even the term capitalism, which I haven't heard us talk about, because one of the things that movements will tell you that we cannot solve the climate crisis at the same place that we created it. So for me, basically, without going deeper, because I know there'll be much wider conversations around the nitty-gritties of it, but I think there's need to pause and think about the ideological, political, theoretical, conversations that are happening within grassroots movements in Africa, but also to link them up transnationally and transversally. So I think for me, at this particular moment, I sit with that, the ideological questions around philanthropy.
Excellent. Big hand. Sithembile, your take.
Okay, thank you, Briggs. And I must say I'm sitting here confused because when I got the invitation, I prepared my, what I wanted to share. But listening to what Maseho has shared, listening to Alan and listening to Nyambura, I find myself thinking, should I stick with the script or should I respond directly?
Please respond directly. Please respond directly.
Hello? Is this better? Okay. All right. So in responding directly, then my figures go out the window and passion comes into play. So I come from an organization that facilitates dialogue between civil society and government. You have to remember that the discussion around climate change at a continental level and at a global level is really led by governments, right? The negotiations, the closed rooms, they happen with governments. But the problem is that who informs those governments? Our governments are going to be going to Egypt, they're going to be negotiating, but who are they negotiating on behalf of? That's where Nyambura's point comes in, to say the grassroots movement wishes is not what's reflected in those negotiations. So as FANRPAN, our work is really to provide the sort of safe space where we bring together civil society, private sector, and government to an even platform. We don't want civil society carrying placards and crying against the government, but we want them informing the positions of government, and that's what we take. And taking from what Maseho said earlier, the focus of the discussions has really been skewed towards the issue of mitigation, which is not really the primary concern of Africa. Yes, we need to, mitigate and cut emissions and whatever. Alan put it rightly to say, that's not really where our biggest concern. It's about helping the vulnerable communities. It's about making sure that they have the right coping mechanisms. It's about making sure that they adapt. And when we really look at it, adaptation finance flows to the continent are very low. This is where I believe comes in philanthropy. We are not going to get help from the West or from the developed nations because they have their own priorities. We need to have African philanthropists coming to the table and putting money where the biggest challenge for Africa is. And that is, we need adaptation money. If you look at the nationally determined contributions of African countries, I think 21 out of those 40 countries have put through agriculture as an area that needs big support, because as a continent, we depend mostly on rain-fed agriculture. And with the way the rains are becoming erratic, droughts and whatever, we're told not to talk about droughts. But when we talk about agriculture and the climate impacts on agriculture, we know what our farmers are enduring. And so we need to see more funding going towards adaptation. We need to close that gap. And that will not be business as usual. We are not going to be waiting for donors to send money. We have to dig deep. Our governments have already committed through the Malabo Declaration and CADEB to put a certain percentage towards agriculture. And that's where we need to be holding them to account. To say, if you commit to something, just come through with that commitment and make sure. But we know that's not enough. We then have to meet them halfway. If government is putting a certain percentage, can we have the private sector coming through and also supporting in a big way? Can we also have our philanthropists also coming through in a big way? So for me, I think those are things that we need to focus on. I think 3 things really that I had sort of listed that I believe still meet is that we need to mainstream resilience in investment decision making. I think Morris, when he spoke about needing to be agile in decision making. We need decision makers that think fast and are able to make decisions based on current situations, not consult and, and do all that. So we need to really think about how do we mainstream resilience in investment decisions. We, of course, need to create an enabling environment for adaptation investment. Money will not just flow into pockets that have holes. Money will flow into systems that can be accountable. Then finally, I think we also need to be aggressive in deploying innovative finance instruments. So it's not just going to be, your usual loans and grants and that sort of thing, but can we think of innovative ways of financing? Thank you.
A big hand to her. Thanks, Sithembile. I'm going to walk up that way, just asking you one question each. Very briefly, if you can just help us explore that a little bit more. So starting with you, Sithembile, you can keep the microphone on. Yeah, because you flagged this issue of financing for climate adaptation. And there is a talk right now around climate-induced indebtedness. As the continent is trying to transition, I think the last statistics I saw, up to 60% of the finances are coming in the form of loans. So we are getting a whole new debt cycle, and debt will ultimately affect the whole economic setup and well-being. As Maseko said in the morning, the whole issue is about well-being, citizen well-being. So I'm inviting you to just say a little bit more around this aspect of financing for climate adaptation, or broadly for the whole transition to sustainability agenda. What are you seeing as some of the barriers that we need to break?
Okay, so I think we definitely need to look at our policies, because I believe some of the biggest barriers have to do with policy and regulatory barriers. So we need to be able to think cleverly around how do we move around our policies. Like if you look at climate smart agriculture, for instance, there is a lack of regulatory incentives around financing climate smart agriculture. And there is need to sort of limit in aggression in terms of the small scale projects that come through. Farmers have a hard time accessing money because they have to jump through hoops. They have to show that they've got land that they can put as guarantee and that sort of thing. They can't access loans because they don't have bank accounts. There are so many hoops that farmers have to jump through, and we really need to look at how can we make it easy for our smallholder farmers to do business, and to do business in a climate smart way.
Okay, thank you. Let me move to the daughter of the rain. So you raised some very critical issues. You raised the question of the ideological dissonance, if we had to put it that way. You paraphrased Albert Einstein. You cannot solve a problem at the same level that you created it. And you raised an issue of different interests. You could even put it to the point of class interest in this conversation. So if we were to place you at the center, place you in the forefront of leading the pathway towards a solution, how would you begin to think about bringing a convergence or resolving those contradictions?
Well, I would prefer to be in a farm somewhere with people, though, than any.
Let's go there. Let's go to that farm.
So, I mean, I actually want to start by actually saying, sorry, just to answer the question, but also just by responding also. I'll start by saying this. African farmers will never entrepreneur themselves out of structural inequalities. And that for me would be my response in a nutshell. A lot of the solutions coming out at the UNFCCC, FDB, investment bankers based in London, Singapore, New York, wherever they may be, have this idea sort of opening up Africa again. You know, this idea, even the whole thing of like, we're giving you loans, we're giving African women loans, whether it's climate smart agriculture. And I speak about this especially because Kenya was one of the first, I think, pilot countries when climate smart agriculture was being proposed. And many farmers in Kenya lost out because they were lied to about the amount of money that they were going to be able to make. But that money literally went to foreign multinational corporations. So the idea, for me, that is the beginning of it. How do we think about justice? Questions of justice. And Masego spoke about it very well without rehashing anything that she said. How do we think about rights-based justice in terms of radical rights-based issues? How do you think about democratic space? How do you think about, because we often don't think about climate justice and climate issues in that form of way. How do we think about reorienting the economies? So that is not just for the local elites or international elites, but an economy that works for farmers, smallholder farmers, it works for traders, it works for ordinary people. So for me, whichever sector it is, whether it's energy, whether it's food, whether it's trade, whether it's the whole agricultural value chain, whether it's transport, infrastructure, those of us who are women, especially care work, climate I really wonder why care work is not, when we talk about the issue of care work, climate change discourse does not center care work. Because we cannot have climate justice without thinking about a politics of care work. We have to center care work because often it's removed. Because it is, women hold this, and not just women, but service workers or workers in their own way, hold this continent in particular forms. So for me, we'll basically be reclaiming a politics of the commons, thinking about indigenous traditional cosmologies, but also thinking about what modern and present futures we want to envision for ourselves. We do not want to follow the development, so-called development trajectories of the North, because that development trajectory has come at the expense of the global South. They're rich because we are poor. We always have to remember that. So for me, it's that. What kind of communities, what kind of visions of liberation, how do we want to be with one another? So for me, that is in a nutshell. But if you want me to get deeper later, but in a nutshell.
Later will be greater.
Yeah.
Alan, let me come to you. You spoke about opportunities existing. It's a moment of opportunities as well for philanthropy to really make a difference in this. The reality presently is that if we were to do a poll in here in terms of the different philanthropic institutions that are present, many do not have coherent climate justice programs or climate change program or work. So if you were to address us, what would be your advice in terms of entry into beginning to seize those opportunities and becoming relevant to what we are all saying is the greatest question of the day?
Sure, yeah. Big question. So I think one thing in terms of starting a climate journey or adopting a climate lens is really to look at how climate affects your existing mandate. Whether you're working across gender, whether you're working across youth,
there we go. So identifying what your stake in the climate agenda is. Because there are multiple levels. There's organizational, there's policies. And in identifying that risk, how are you engaging with your partners and the work you do support? So this is very internal. It's, let's call it a climate risk audit. That's the starter. Because if you know what's threatening your mandate, climate change is going to undermine every philanthropic objective, no matter how noble it is. Let's just be clear. COVID, we could not plan for it, but we've seen the disruption. Climate change, we can actually start planning. For philanthropy to address systems change, you can put something in now. Yes, the results may only yield in 10, 15 years, but there is a leeway. 10 years, it's not a lot, but we can avoid being caught off guard, like we saw with COVID. But I think back to what we should be doing in the room, it's so refreshing to be able to have a conversation about climate change that isn't purely about saving the planet, about the Greta-type model of activism, about the copy and paste type of campaigns we see in Europe, which are trying to fit in, but it's putting a square into a circle. Africa, one, is not homogenous, and there is the risk that you also need to looking, I think, how many countries have we got in this room? I'm sure there must be 15, 20 African countries represented directly or indirectly. Each country is different. So it's also about understanding how your country, your economy, and the different stakeholders are affected by climate change, because it's not homogenous. And in order to really look at solutions, you have to look at the needs. And I think that speaks to looking at the structural inequalities and the lived experience of climate and the responsibility of government and the accountability factor of governments and how they take those to, and who they are accountable. Let's also appreciate that there's a geopolitics and a diplomacy at play where there are vested interests, both private and international, which mean it's a difficult space to navigate. And I think the last thing I would recommend is that let's start here. The climate is complex. We're not going to have all the solutions today, but a commitment of this meeting to create an African climate and philanthropy network where we're building a strategy and to use entities like the ACF, which was set up. We currently manage funds on behalf of 10 donors. We have a staff of 20 in 5 countries. We have specialists, we have grant makers. The idea there is saying is that you don't have to reorientate your organization. There are entities, there are networks, there are partners in this room on this panel that can give some ideas, to speak to your boards, to speak to your stakeholders. And then last of, let's think beyond grants. Let's think beyond the more charity-esque type approach to grant making, to actually investing in opportunities, investing in initiatives. We're currently exploring supporting 6 female farmers to do regen agriculture, to see whether or not, if you could fund 100 women, what would that look like for the local economy? So this idea of changing the way we invest, what we invest in, and saying that it's not just a grant, it's not just something that we hope will be nice. Let's crowd an investment. Let's do proof of concept. Be that catalytic capital that often most funders wouldn't fund. So there, I'll stop there. I'm getting excited. You see, care big.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Nyambura. Thank you, Sithembile. Please give them a big hand. You saw the Master of Ceremonies whispering to me. You are saying this is really, really going great. Can you please reiterate and emphasize the key points? But now I remember we are short of time, so I would not do that. Apologies, Master of Ceremony. We will end here. There's going to be some breakaway sessions where we are going to explore these very same issues further, and colleagues will be able to contribute. So thank you very much. Another hand.